to a reading culture, what we're looking at is fostering reading engagement, and that's got two kind of main aspects to it. We want to increase young people's attitudes towards reading, and we also want to increase their frequency of engagement in the practice. So those two things, attitudes and frequency of engagement in the practice, are both associated, as you know, in the literature with improved literacy outcomes. So when we are thinking about creating a reading culture, it's not just about getting them reading more, it's also creating this kind of social climate, this social environment where reading is really embraced and celebrated, socially positioned as a positive thing. And so those things need to work together. We need to be thinking about both the frequency and the attitudinal shifts. And so when we're looking at the reading culture, everyone in the school becomes implicated in that. All of the teachers, all of the leadership team, they play that key role in modeling those positive reading practices and, you know, supporting that plan for transformation into a school reading culture, however that is positioned within the school.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to the School Library Research Chats podcast. I'm Joyce Valenza. I'm an associate professor of teaching at Rutgers University, and this evening I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Brenda Boyer, and she will introduce herself in a moment. Our podcast honors the work and the memory of Dr. Ross J. Todd. In each episode, we explore how research in the school library world and the related disciplines present critical evidence to inform and hopefully inspire our practice. We're supported by Rutgers University with the Association of the International Association of School Librarians. And tonight we are so excited to welcome Dr. Margaret Merga all the way from Perth, Australia. And she's joining us in the podcast. And I think let's just begin by briefly having you share a bit about yourself, where you work, the type of work you do, the type of research you do. And I have to say, you are prolific, Margaret. You've been busy.
Thanks very much, Joyce. Yes, I started out post-PhD in 2014, working in academia for, I guess it was about 8 or 9 years, and doing a lot of research in that time, looking at libraries and literacy and overall the role that, you know, libraries can play in really enhancing student learning, not just in literacy, but also in areas like digital health literacy, well-being, and information literacy more generally. I luckily was able to win quite a few grants during that time, which funded that research and enabled me to have the resources to be able to go into schools and speak with students and also teacher librarians and, capture like data from a variety of different stakeholders. And so when COVID came along and my research was suspended because I couldn't go into schools anymore, I took a good look at where I was at in terms of my professional trajectory and decided that that would be a great time to step away from academia and into the other kind of area that I'm really passionate about, which is knowledge mobilization. So basically taking all of the research method skills as well as the research background and bringing it into schools, professional associations and government departments and kind of teaching them how to do things like evaluation, but also giving them the overall picture and where we're at in terms of best practice in, building reading engagement in our students and schools. So that shift from kind of the purely kind of research side into the kind of more practical side of taking that research and translating it to something really meaningful that anyone can kind of pick up and work with is obviously really important and something that I've enjoyed a lot.
I have never heard the phrase knowledge mobilization before. And I think about how important it is for research not to just sit around, but for it to be informing our practice, as we mentioned before, and used. I just love that phrase, and I don't think we use it here in the States. We talk about application of research. We talk about action research. Which informs practice, but I haven't heard that before. Is that something unique to Australia?
No, it's actually big in the US, but not in our field. That's another thing. I've always been a cross-disciplinary researcher. So in addition to publishing in education, I've also published in bibliometrics, published in communications, published in higher education journals, published in health journals. I have a lot of interests that are multidisciplinary, which means I have a wide range of audiences. And knowledge mobilization primarily comes from those higher education and communication contexts where there's that desire of researchers to get the most bang for their buck. And as we're increasingly receiving funding from external providers in industry, but also government departments and things like that, it's not something that we can ignore. At the end of the day, those funders need to see that the research that they have paid for has made it out of academia's ivory tower into actually impacting real world outcomes. And particularly in Australia, but also in the UK, it's required that when you submit for a grant, you need to show that translation plan. How will the knowledge be mobilized? Will it be unidirectional, or is it going to become part of an exchange process that will enable those end users to feedback, if they're in the school library, and influence what the researcher does, both in the present, but also in future planning. And it's very exciting because, when you're a researcher, you spend a lot of time meeting the needs of other researchers, producing outputs in peer-reviewed journals and things like that. And as you mentioned, I've really leaned into that in the past. But what we really want to see is we want to walk into a school and see those great practices that we've identified in research being used, and seeing smiles on children's faces, seeing, progress in literacy outcomes and other positive real-world gains as a result of the research we're doing. That's where we're going to get the professional satisfaction. So in addition to doing research in libraries and literacy, etc., I've also done quite a bit of research in research communication.
Excellent. Well, it is. We know this is important, but it's wonderful to hear it phrased this way, and to understand how important it is to include in a grant proposal, and to also to address as part of your results and the implications of research. Speaking of all this, you have a new book. Can you tell us the title?
Yeah, I'm really excited about my new book that's going to be coming out really soon. I just finished copy editing it yesterday, which was quite an exciting moment to get that over the line. And it's about creating whole school reading cultures, and it's going to be, quite comprehensive when you get it, because it deals with not just the research in the field, but also the practical implications of how to do it. The specific title is Creating a Reading Culture in Primary and Secondary Schools, a Practical Guide. And I think that also kind of shows what my priority was when it came to coming up with the book, is that I wanted to create something that was really strongly research informed, but with really practical elements in it, like literally templates for your planning that you can use in order to plan for evaluation, step-by-step processes on how to do simple data analysis, qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods, so that you can show what you've done in the school and promote that, show your school leaders, wow, we've made a difference, using data in really sensible ways and straightforward ways to do that. And the book, takes you through the concepts, but then takes you through really practical examples of what it can look like in the real world, and, hold your hand through the different steps in achieving those goals. So when we want to approach a school leader and argue for that kind of change, which can often be sweeping, particularly if we're requiring, time to read for pleasure during the school kind of timetabling, you can't just turn up to a school leader and say, hey, let's do this. There needs to be that comprehensive planning that shows that there's going to be aspects of evaluation and close consideration of, delivering the evidence, delivering the outcomes, so that they can also promote that within the broader school community. We've had some great successes here in Australia where, national media has picked up these kinds of initiatives in schools and promoted them, Sydney Morning Herald and the like, because the public is interested in seeing improved literacy outcomes. So taking the time to, develop a good, robust plan that is supported by the research, but also follows best practice and evaluation, can really help schools to get where they want to go, and also make changes iteratively along that process.
Wonderful. I want Brenda to dig into the questions in a moment, but I think the idea of really thinking about school culture in a broad and systemic way is critical. We have students who will have one amazing teacher who just develops this real joy in their classroom, and then the next year they're faced with a teacher who is not as capable, or doesn't see that as the focus. But a whole school culture makes so much sense when it comes to reading and literacy. And I just wonder one more thing before we get Brenda into digging into the questions. Your audience for this is predominantly librarians, classroom teachers, administrators, everyone?
Anyone, anyone who
Everyone.
wants it can pick up the book and do it. If they're, I guess, I'm often thinking about school library professionals when I write my work of any kind, because they're the audience that I spend the most time working with. In terms of clients and schools, it's often a library manager that will bring me in terms of the work I've done with the government. Sometimes it's been someone who was previously affiliated with a school library who makes that contract happen. So I'm always thinking about, also they're the ones who are in that position often of leading from the library these kinds of systemic changes. So while the school library professional is probably the number one target audience, a school leader can pick it up. And I'm actually working at the moment with a school leader who did pick it up and, got really excited about it. And he's a principal who used to be a math teacher. So it shows that it can have like an appeal, not just within the school library community, but also in the school leadership community, English, or you call them language arts, learning area professionals, anyone within a school in an educational role that wants to pick it up and lead the initiative. There's a section on change management. There's a section on how you recruit the team to make that happen. It really does take you through every single kind of step so that anyone can pick it up and work with it. And not just in Australia. The research informing this book comes from all over the world. And so that means that there's going to ideally, hopefully, be that broad applicability of the strategies and also the research in the book.
Great. So, Dr. Boyer, would you like to dig in?
Sure. So let's start at the beginning. And Margaret, if you could give us your definition of what you mean by a reading culture for our viewers, if you could explain that.
Sure. So when it comes to a reading culture, what we're looking at is fostering reading engagement. And that's got two kind of main aspects to it. We want to increase young people's attitudes towards reading, and we also want to increase their frequency of engagement in the practice. So those two things, attitudes and frequency of engagement in the practice, are both associated, as you know, in the literature with improved literacy outcomes. So when we are thinking about creating a reading culture, it's not just about getting them reading more, it's also creating this kind of social climate, this social environment where reading is really embraced and celebrated, socially positioned as a positive thing. And so those things need to work together. We need to be thinking about both the frequency and the attitudinal shifts. And so when we're looking at the reading culture, everyone in the school becomes implicated in that. All of the teachers, all of the leadership team, they play that key role in modeling those positive reading practices and, supporting that plan for transformation into a school reading culture, however that is positioned within the school.
Excellent. So why is it very important to make a research-supported argument for establishing this reading culture?
And some researchers have referred to different aspects of a reading culture plan, such as silent reading, as fluffy pedagogies, which means that often someone externally viewing the practices that we use as part of developing a reading culture, such as silent reading or reading aloud to students, and talking about books in the context of pleasure, not just assessment, and think, they're all having a good time. Where's the learning? But the reality is, we've got that body of research that shows that positioning books and reading in a positive context leads to positive change. Those attitudes towards reading are associated with improvement in literacy performance. And those opportunities for deep, sustained reading have quite a wide array of benefits. So we really need to make sure that we're showing that, yes, these things are not just fluffy pedagogies. These are practices that have research support behind them. And we can, show that research support. And, in current times, in the last couple of years, there's been a real increase, particularly from European researchers in this area, of the body of research that we have around reading for pleasure and the benefits. And, if we can show that those large scale studies in particular, it just makes our argument more powerful and also, justifies the time and resourcing that are going to be invested in these kinds of plans.
I read an article fairly recently that talked about sustained silent reading as more effective with children who are already readers, and that it is possible that students who are not engaged readers may have issues with sustained silent reading, and that's a practice. That's the way we call it, or what we've come to call it in the States. Has that been in any of the evidence that you've looked at?
So I think what you're kind of saying is that if students have weak literacy skills, they might not benefit as much from silent reading. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, independent classroom structured. So for the next 15 minutes, we are going to grab our books and read our own books. And for many people, me, you, Brenda, that would have been a joy. But is it a joy for every child?
Absolutely, that's a great point. And I have a section in the book on struggling literacy learners, and my last book actually focused quite strongly on them. So basically, in that situation, this is why when I talk about a reading culture, opportunities for sustained silent reading is not the only part of that. It's actually a very, just one component of many. And when it comes to transforming and building the skills, obviously there's a lot of explicit literacy instruction that's occurring in the space. It's really important. We don't have a reading culture in isolation. It's in partnership with the strategies that we know work well in schools around building literacy. But we also know that there are quite a few of these strategies related to building a whole reading culture that also offer benefits for struggling literacy learners. And I'm thinking in particular of a great study that came out of the UK in relatively recent times that looked at reading aloud to secondary school students. And they found massive gains for struggling literacy learners. And it wasn't reading aloud, which was very interruptive. So you start reading the book, and every 2 seconds we pause to take a look at the verbs, or let's have fun with the tense changes, or let's think about imagery. None of that was happening. It was building that excitement. It was building that narrative tension. When the kids came back into reading the book, listening to the book being read and reading along, the next day there'd be a quick recap for any child that wasn't there, and then bam, straight back into the action. So this exposure to this rapid narrative reading really did lead to very significant reading comprehension gains, particularly for the struggling literacy learners. And it was interesting because reading that paper, teachers were nervous about being part of that study because it was conducted in the UK. Obviously, they've got quite strict regulation over what can and can't be done in schools there. You're probably familiar with their regulatory bodies. And the idea of people sticking their head in the windows, peering in and going, oh my goodness, they're all listening to someone reading to them. Where's the learning in this? But the learning was magnificent. The learning was, far outstripped what most interventions would manage to achieve. So I guess it's a matter of kind of understanding reading culture as being multifaceted, and each facet offering different kind of potential for all groups, not just confident avid readers, but that's that focus of building the gains, but also the attitudes and the engagement of struggling literacy learners as well, by using these kinds of creative interventions that enable them to enjoy and take part in that process of understanding work, and have opportunities to have higher level engagement with that work that might be impeded by their own independent reading skills through kind of adjunct interventions such as reading aloud to them. And yeah, I think it's exciting, and the idea of everyone being able to share the experience together through these kinds of measures and kind of build that really positive, cohesive, supportive environment for reading is something that I think a lot of people who are interested in literacy would be keen to embrace.
Fine. Great.
That's great. And through those are research supported activities, of course, the teacher modeling the reading aloud. So would you also say that students can read anything for those literacy gains?
See, that's a really interesting area because the research we have suggests that reading of fiction books is the text type most associated with literacy gains. But in recent times, there's been some very recent research that came out that suggests that reading of non-fiction books can offer equal benefit, particularly for boys. When we're encouraging students to read during silent reading time, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be reading anything else but books, because obviously reading different text types gives exposure to different kinds of literacies, visual literacy in the case of graphic novels and things like that. And so it's not just about, gains in terms of reading comprehension and vocabulary that we're looking for, but it does kind of underscore the fact that it remains important that we suggest to the young people that they continue to keep books in their diet so that they can continue to, have the opportunity to apply sustained attention to reading a more extended narrative. And particularly in areas such as reading fiction books, that's also been in recent times associated with benefits for things like perspective taking and empathy and those kinds of pro-social skills that we like to see our young people develop so that they can be, kind and generous citizens in the world. And, they're the ones that are going to be changing the culture moving forward. So if we can bring them up to, consider the perspective of others who come from very different backgrounds and have very different lived experiences to them, then we're kind of helping them to, build into the kinds of adults that we want to share the planet with. So, yeah, I mean, that's the thing with fiction books is the benefits aren't only around those literacy indicators, but they're also those broader pro-social benefits.
I imagine that some narrative nonfiction will produce similar gains because you do get into they are story, and they may again be more. I do have my background in high school libraries. I had more boys who were nonfiction readers, and I would give them a great biography of a president that I knew was done in a beautifully narrative way. And they would gobble those up in a way that they didn't do fiction. Of course, that was idiosyncratic, but to each reader his book or their book.
Absolutely. And I think you're, absolutely right about that. The difference between narrative, nonfiction and fiction. Often I'm thinking of a particular disgraced sports personality whose autobiography was shifted from narrative nonfiction into fiction shortly after we discovered he made up a lot of it and, was under the influence of drugs for a large portion. So, as you mentioned, the line is very fine there. There is one kind of cautionary area, and that would be more in relation to reading informational nonfiction rather than narrative nonfiction, is that often boys get pushed into reading informational nonfiction around trucks and cars and snakes and things like that, due to a kind of conception that boys prefer that kind of literature. But according to my research, but also a large scale OECD international research that I cite in my papers, that's not actually research supported, that the fact that boys prefer nonfiction. They actually prefer fiction in general, but there are also girls that really like nonfiction, and there are also boys that really like nonfiction. There are also a lot of kids that like both. So I guess while I absolutely kind of believe that students should have that freedom when they're reading, I do also warn against that kind of pink box, blue box mentality where boys have been pushed into informational, particularly when it's not going to offer the same benefits for building those kinds of perspective taking skills and things like that.
Absolutely. That's a very critical point. And I know Brenda, who has raised two boys, may have opinions about that. And as also a high school librarian, I wonder if format matters much. You didn't mention graphic novels. I am a crazy audiobook person, and so is my son right now. Is there research that supports the value of audio and as reading?
I've actually included a section in the book on audiobooks this time. At every conference I go to, when I ask for questions at the end, someone will always put their hand up and say, Margaret, talk about audiobooks. Why aren't you talking more about audiobooks? And that's because while we do have some kind of building research in that space, we don't have anywhere near as much as we have in other areas. And that's not to say it's less beneficial, it just simply means it's, been given less research attention. But I feel like there was enough to kind of talk about it a bit in the book, and the benefits of, audiobooks are obviously can be similar to those of, being read to aloud, which we know, are substantial. And I feel like particularly for struggling literacy learners, I often talk with school library professionals who are already experimenting with having those students reading along with a book that they're also listening to. And while we need so much more research in this space, anecdotally and also in relation to some research that's been done with ESL learners, we do know that listening as we read along can be a powerful adjunct for the struggling literacy learners, though we do need more research in that space. So somebody listening to this, please do that research. Thank you.
Yeah. Brenda, I have a question, but I want you to
go right ahead. Go right ahead, Joyce.
Okay, so we are both working and doing our best to prepare the professionals that you're working with. And I know, Margaret, you've taught as well. What do our LIS students need to know to be ready to build reading culture? What should we be including in our courses that would support, including the evaluation piece, I think, because I have that, but I have that built into my classes, but not necessarily built in a way that would actually represent gains in interest in reading, gains in reading achievement. I'm not really sure what we're measuring, and I feel students who are listening to this, I'm being honest with you, I feel like I'm not exactly sure what's really important for you to take home with you or take into your libraries with you. Margaret's going to help us with that.
Yeah, sure. So there is a chapter in the book on evaluation, and I'm actually a massive methods nerd. Like, I love methods so much. I've gone to international methods conferences to just sit there and listen to what everyone else says. And my own work is, been a broad reflection of that, passion that I have for methods. I've done everything from autoethnography to hybrid content analysis to, different kinds of quantitative measures, but also looking at all kinds of different ways of using a variety of different qualitative data sources and integrating them in mixed methods approaches. So when it comes to methods, I just love them. So what I wanted to do once I got out of academia and start working with schools and government departments and professional associations more directly is to take those method skills and translate them to those, real world contexts, so that professionals outside academia can pick up those methods and use them in ways that work for them. So obviously they don't need to apply the same kinds of rigor that we, take.
No IRB is required.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to take it through ethics approval, thank goodness. But at the same time, you need to have ethical considerations and I talk about those sorts of things in the book as well. But at the end of the day, I mean, you need to have like really simple explanation of what evaluation is. When we think about evaluation, often it's quantitative evaluation where we're comparing our baseline data, which is data we collect at the beginning of an initiative, and then we compare it to some, a later point. So for example, if you wanted to introduce silent reading in your school and you wanted to do that in order to see gains in students' attitudes towards reading, then you would test their attitudes in a survey at the baseline, which is at the beginning before you actually start doing this initiative, and then perhaps 6 months down the track, survey the students again and look at if there have been changes in attitudes. So that's very simple, very straightforward. But that's not the only way of doing it, because when you are reporting back to your school leader and you can show, oh, look, we've had this magnificent change, kids are more, positive towards reading, sometimes they'll just look at the numbers and be like, yeah, because they're getting a lot of numbers across their desk. There's a lot going on across the curriculum. So this is where taking a mixed methods approach and evaluation can be really great, because in addition to the numbers, you might have some really beautiful writing that students have done around that opportunity, or a great picture that children in primary school have, drawn to express how they feel in these kinds of reading opportunities, that will also land on the desk at the same time and, make that argument more powerful and, perhaps resonate beyond the numbers. So when I, perhaps the meatiest, apart from the chapter on the research, perhaps the meatiest chapter in my new book is on evaluation that takes you through quantitative, qualitative and mixed methods approaches in ways that don't assume you have a rich and deep knowledge in those areas. I mean, I go right back to, averaging and mean and percentage and things like that, but I also apply it to those kind of real world contexts, like what would you do if you had a story dog come in, students are reading to that, and how can you evaluate that in really simple ways. And I also, I get down to the minutiae of how to design a survey item that actually asks what you think it's asking, how to pilot that survey item with your group to make sure that it's understood the way you think it's going to be. And I've had some really hilarious moments in past research where in my mind I've been so sure that the survey question is very clear, it can't possibly be misunderstood, and lo and behold, it has been. For example, when you ask students how old they are, they often want to round it up. And we published this in a paper in Computers in Education, and the peer reviewers came back and said, we love that you've included these piloting experiences in this paper, because it's good for other professionals to kind of learn from that. And it was great, hearing kids during the piloting process saying, yeah, well, I'm 8 now, but in like 6 months I'm going to be 9, so can I just say 9? And I'm like, no. You and you, none of you can say 9. You all need to say 9, please. Otherwise, we're going to have, data that makes it look like, for some reason, all of these kids are much older than they should be.
Right.
So, we changed that item to how old are you right now? So the student could just sit there and be like, okay, yes, I'm 8. So these are the kinds of things as an adult. I don't know anyone who's rounding their age up. We're all kind of like, yes, I'm in my 40s. Even if we're, a little bit towards the upper end of that, we're rounding down where we can. So you often can't imagine how your survey items are going to be received by different demographics, particularly when you're working with children. And so that's why piloting is so important if you want to collect quality data.
Mm-hmm. So surveys, focus groups.
Absolutely. The book looks at surveys, focus groups, using video data, using drawings that students do, using visual diaries. The list goes on, and all different kinds of ways. And each time I present a new kind of data that can be used, I also present a suggestion for how you might use it. So it can go in. That's the problem when you being introduced to a whole heap of new approaches and concepts. If you don't see it applied in a real world context, pretty much straight away, it's not going to go in. It's not going to become part of your arsenal moving forward. Straight out of the toolbox. So the real emphasis of the book was to make sure that every time I introduced something new, that you could see, oh yeah, I could use it like this, or I could use it like that, in the real world pretty much straight away. And I mean, I feel like in the research area, often in education research in particular, a lot of our research is qualitative and that's great because we need to have that qualitative exploratory research. But sometimes when you read a research question or an outcome, you're like, oh, actually, it would have been great to collect some quantitative data on this as well. And you realize that in some cases, the reason why the researcher hasn't done that is because they don't have confidence to move into that area. So whether they're like a qualitative researcher that's nervous about moving into quantitative approaches or the reverse, it's really useful to have that overview of understanding of methods. And it's while I've written this book for practitioners and schools, I feel like that if you were a junior researcher or a researcher looking to expand the amount of methods that they have at their disposal, this could be quite a useful introductory text for that because it deals with everything at a very basic level and it applies it pretty much straight away.
So I'm just curious. So I love the focus on evaluation, data collection, starting with baseline. And a lot of librarians are not doing that right now, but it's so important. You need to show that your work has impact. One of the things I was thinking about as you were talking about the evaluation, I wondered what we're evaluating. What are the interventions that you suggest librarians and schools put in place to build those reading cultures that we're going to be evaluating? Are there interventions that you're particularly fond of?
Yeah, absolutely. And in I think it's the second chapter of the book, I go through, I think there are 11 approaches that can work that are research supported. And so I go kind of list through them, and they're everything from things like, there's opportunities for sustained silent reading, to opportunities to exposure to read aloud, to things like different key agents modeling, such as teacher modeling, opportunities for discussion around books, all these kinds of things. They're in there, explanations of what they look like, but also the research that supports it. And where possible, I've taken the research and then shown, how might this look like in a really simple step-by-step best practice. one thing that viewers might find useful is I've done quite a bit of work with a platform called The Conversation, which I know isn't that big in the US, but it's pretty big in Australia and also in Europe. Because basically researchers go on there, you've got a really low success rate, like 4% or something like around 4% actually get accepted, because so many researchers want to use this platform as a vehicle for translating their knowledge. But I've gone on there and I've done things like, if you want to read aloud and you're a parent, how do you do that? What's the research supported way? And in The Conversation, there are also embedded hyperlinks. Now, the cool thing about The Conversation, and at the end of this, you can Google The Conversation, Margaret Merga, is that all of these resources are free and they're also Creative Commons licensed. So what that means is anyone who wants to pick them up and insert them directly into their school newsletter or send home to parents has got complete freedom to do that. So yeah, I would really strongly encourage you to just avail yourself of those resources if you like. If you don't want to, buy the book, but you are interested in, taking parents through steps about what they can do to, get their child reading at home, just help yourself to those resources. And if people want the greater research depth, the hyperlinks are there for them to access to kind of get that sense of the evidence behind it. So yeah.
And we'll link to The Conversation and any other resources you suggest, along with the audio and the video of this talk. You just mentioned parents, and I know that's a huge part of what's going on, what's supported at home, but also what parents are seeing is happening in their schools. So you do have a chapter, I believe, on parent support. Can you tell us what best practice looks like in connecting with parents, building community, home and school collaboration on reading?
Sure. It's kind of interwoven within a number of sections within the book, perhaps most prominently in the stakeholder engagement section, because I feel like, as a former teacher as well as a researcher, we don't always hit the mark when it comes to communicating with linguistically diverse communities and, thinking practically about how to kind of make sure that the knowledge that we're sharing doesn't just go to the children who already have literacy rich homes in the English language literacy. So it's a matter of, the book includes really simple things for, if you're a new educator and you want to share this information at home, how do you make sure that it's going to kind of resonate? If you're inviting parents to become part of initiatives within the school, how are you going to avoid excluding parents who aren't confident in their English literacy or who work long hours and who, simply don't have the kinds of facilities that other parents may have, to avoid continuing to reinforce that gap? So I've actually included things like practical links to readability tools. Now, I don't know if listeners are across what readability is, so I'm going to quickly explain it. Okay. So I have done research on this, and I'll talk. When COVID-19 came out, I looked at some of the online resources that were being produced by the government. And because I also do research in adult literacy, I was pretty concerned because they were pitched at too high a level for these adult, for a good chunk of the population to actually be able to understand. So that everyone's freaking out about anti-vaxxers and misinformation and disinformation. But if the quality information that's being put out by the government is excluding a significant portion of the population because it's pitched at far too high a level of literacy, then we've got a massive issue, right? We've got people going around without masks in, areas where there's a high level of infection and, can literally kill people. If we can't get those messages out in language that can be understood. So there are tools such as the SMOG readability tool, but there's also a new tool that's been developed by a university in Australia called Shell. These are all free to access online. And if you want to make sure that your teachers, your parents, on the receiving end of your missives about what you want to do in the school are actually able to pick up, the things you'd like them to be doing at home, you need to just take those messages that you generate and just paste them into the readability tool. Now, that's going to tell you if you have pitched your message at university level or if you have more appropriately pitched it at ideally around a grade 5 or 6 level. And I know that sounds wild because I'm primarily going to be talking to university educated people here. But the reality is, according to the research we have, particularly around health communication, is that, and I know you're probably familiar with this research given your research fields. But we need to be pitching for the general population in that grade 5, 6 level, and not assume that everyone's walking around with a university level of English literacy, even if they've got very strong literacy in their first language, which isn't English. So these are really simple things that we can do just to make sure that, oh, all right, okay, I've whacked it in there, and bam, it's come back that I've produced university level stuff here for my parents. So I know I need to try to lower that down a bit. So let me take a look at the jargon. Let me take a look at this massive sentence that goes for 8 lines. Let me take a look at these different kind of facets that impact on readability. And it's really simple to make a few adjustments to bring that down to a level where people can read it and understand it. I mean, even for your highly literate parent,
Yeah.
the highly literate parent that's really busy doesn't want to have to wade through jargon, doesn't want to have to wade through a complex sentence in order to extract meaning. They want to be able to just, yes, I know what I need to be doing at home. I need to, actually go and get that library card from the local public library because this is what they're telling me to do this time. So I'm just going to go do that. There need to be short, sharp, clear messages at an appropriate readability level. And sometimes, depending on your community, might be better to have it verbally delivered through a short YouTube style clip with subtitles below. There are all different kind of considerations that we can make to enhancing our accessibility that aren't actually going to be that time consuming for us.
And be able to translate these as well into multiple languages.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you know your community and you know which kind of subgroups are within it, linguistic subgroups, absolutely, as you say, those machine-generated subtitles can be a little hit and miss, but the meaning of them can be ultimately discerned in many cases. So, and if you've got someone in the school community that is a member of that linguistic subgroup who can pass a quick eye over that to check that you haven't said something rude through the machine translation, which does happen, then that's going to be even better. But yeah, it's an exciting time because we've got those accessibility affordances and they're just getting better and better. So let's make the most of them.
This is just fantastic, Margaret. Your whole book is about communicating better and, not only building this tremendous reading culture that's so important in our schools, but communicating what we do, why we do it, and so on. So I was just wondering, we talked about several of those research supported practices. If you would leave us with just one, I know you talked a little bit about audiobooks, but is there anything else over the horizon that's a sort of an emerging possibility for a research supported practice for literacy?
Yeah, great. And I do have a section there on emerging possibilities. And I'm looking forward in the future to shuffling things out of emerging possibilities into the kind of main body of these are things you should do. But there's one very cute thing at the moment that's in there, and that's using story dogs. Now, I know not all schools will be able to kind of, make the most of the story dog because it's not going to be practical in all contexts. But there's, a growing body of research coming out around story dog use that shows that, sitting down and reading aloud to a story dog, building their proficiency while patting something gorgeous, can lower levels of anxiety, increase kind of sense of well-being, give students that opportunity to really practice reading without that sense of judgment. Now, one thing that's really stood out with me when I did interviews with children in primary school about their experiences of reading aloud is sometimes they did really feel judged and they were disappointed in themselves. And they were like, oh, my mum is just hanging in there. Her teeth are gritted. She is tolerating me reading to her, but she is only barely doing so because of my, my challenges in kind of getting this out. Another thing that really kind of stuck with me is talking with students about, how they didn't have those opportunities to read aloud to anyone. And then they'd be expected to stand in front of the class and read out loud in front of their peers who were having those opportunities in home. And they knew there was a big gap between their level of proficiency and confidence and the peers. And as the researcher on the other end, I'm like, yeah, you've also told me you've had literally no opportunities to practice at home. And I'm sure these students that you think are so much smarter than you are ultimately just having more opportunities to practice in, they're possibly an intellectual difference, but possibly not at all. It possibly could purely be down to those opportunities for practice. And I really hate that. Kids look at that and they think, oh, I'm dumber than this person because they haven't had the same level of opportunity. So if we can have a chance to sit and read through an incredibly cute, fluffy thing, and give it a bit of a scritch behind the ears while we're reading, and build that confidence and have, practice with that fluency, and have that enjoyable experience. I mean, I feel like that's something that many children will look back on fondly, and they will associate reading with a positive experience rather than an experience where they're going to be consistently judged and found lacking. So there's been some gorgeous studies in that space. One study from the US took children out to an actual dog shelter, and the children were sitting behind the bars reading aloud to the dogs in the dog shelter. And I just thought that was gorgeous. And yeah, I would love to see more research in that.
And how memorable that is, and how you're going to always associate reading with this moment where that experience happened. I love that.
Yeah, and that's what culture is all about. It's got to be positive to survive.
Creating these moments in so many different ways.
Absolutely. And one thing that my research did touch on is that unfortunately, children in both primary and secondary contexts, so both elementary and high school, we have inadvertently communicated to them that reading is something that is done for the purposes of testing. I have many students come to me and said, oh, reading was really important while I was learning to read, and it's still important when I do my testing, but otherwise it has no relevance for me, because those messages about the ongoing importance of reading for pleasure are really falling behind the wayside for different reasons that I cover in my book. But this is why, if we want to build that strong reading culture, that we need to really take into account, how are we going to make it something that can compete with the other leisure pursuits, and how can we make it something that can compete with the sense of failure, compounded failure, that some students have brought in, through the years of schooling because of perhaps in many cases early level disadvantage in terms of exposure to literacy in the home. How can we make those positive memories, as you're saying, made a really good point there. So I feel like creating that whole school reading culture plays a really important role in that regard.
This is just fantastic. This is such an important book. And I know Dr. Valenza's mind is going like, this is a text we need for every class. This is great.
Margaret, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am very excited about sharing your book with our students and adding it to the Rutgers Library so it can be accessible. I'm also very excited about sharing your talk with our students in library programs all over the world. So thank you. Any last words of advice for aspiring librarians?
Yes, have confidence in the fact that you actually have higher levels of information and digital literacy than a lot of the people that you'll be working with. So when it comes to things like data, don't, be confident in the way you present it. And also, you can step up into that space and you can teach others. The kinds of data literacy skills that you will learn through your courses, but also through reading books like mine, you're going to get a really great transferable subset of skills that you can hand to the sport teacher, that you can hand to the leadership team. They can use it in their own initiatives, which again increases how you can kind of embed yourself as a, absolutely key resource within the school. So you can give a shot to that and let me know how it goes.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you so much.